I thought I knew who I was until a simple DNA test revealed I belonged to a culture I'd never even heard of. Growing up in suburban Ohio, I was as American as apple pie, or so I thought. My name is Jennifer. I'm 34 years old, and until 6 months ago, I would have confidently told you my family tree was as straightforward as they come. My parents, Linda and Robert, raised me with stories of our Irish and German heritage. Every St. Patrick's Day, Mom would make corned beef and cabbage while Dad regaled us with tales of our ancestors, who supposedly came over during the potato famine. The walls of our family home were decorated with Celtic knots and German beer steins that Dad collected from various trips. I grew up believing I was part of this rich European tapestry. In high school, I even wrote a family history project about our immigration story, complete with a hand-drawn family tree that traced our roots back to County Cork, Ireland, and Bavaria, Germany. My teacher gave me an A+, and I was so proud to present it to my extended family at our annual Christmas gathering. Uncle Mike nodded approvingly as I talked about our shared Celtic blood, while Aunt Patricia chimed in with her own stories about visiting the homeland in Germany. My childhood was filled with what I now realize were carefully constructed narratives. Mom would point to my green eyes and fair skin as proof of our Irish lineage, while Dad insisted my stubborn streak came straight from our German ancestors. You get that determination from the Schmidt side, he'd say with a chuckle whenever I refused to back down from an argument. It all made perfect sense to me. I fit the mold they'd created, and I never questioned it. When I went to college, I majored in European history, partly because I felt this deep connection to the continent I believed my family had called home for generations. I spent a semester studying abroad in Ireland, walking through the streets of Dublin and feeling like I was retracing the footsteps of my great-great-grandparents. I even visited a small village in County Cork that Dad had mentioned in his stories, taking pictures by what I thought might have been my ancestral home. The whole trip felt like a homecoming, like I was finally connecting with my true heritage. After graduation, I married my college sweetheart, David, and we settled down in Cincinnati. We have 2 beautiful children now, Emma, who's 8, and Jake, who's 6. David's family has deep roots in Ohio going back 5 generations, so we always joked that our kids were getting the best of both worlds, his Midwestern stability and my European wanderlust. We even planned future family trips to Ireland and Germany so the kids could experience their heritage firsthand. My parents were the typical American success story, or so it seemed. Dad worked his way up from factory floor to management at a manufacturing company, while Mom taught elementary school for 30 years before retiring. They were pillars of our community, involved in the local Catholic Church, and known for hosting the best neighborhood barbecues. Everyone loved Linda and Robert. They were the couple other families aspired to be like. But there were always these little moments that didn't quite add up, though I never paid much attention to them at the time, like how Mom would get uncomfortable when people asked detailed questions about her childhood, or how Dad seemed to know surprisingly little about specific German traditions, despite claiming such strong heritage. When I'd press them for more family stories or ask to see old photographs, they'd change the subject or say the pictures were lost in a basement flood years ago. Mom also had this habit of getting nervous around certain topics. Whenever I mentioned wanting to do more research into our family history or suggested we take one of those heritage DNA tests that were becoming popular, she'd quickly shut down the conversation. Why do we need to know more than we already do? She'd say we know we're Irish and German. That's enough. At the time, I thought she was just being practical, maybe even a little old-fashioned about privacy. Looking back now, there were other signs too. Mom spoke with this slight accent that she claimed came from growing up around her Irish grandmother, but it never quite sounded right to me. And Dad's knowledge of German culture seemed to come entirely from Oktoberfest celebrations and history documentaries rather than actual family traditions passed down through generations. But I was young, trusting, and had no reason to doubt the story I'd been told my entire life. The truth is, I built my entire identity around this narrative. I chose my college major, my travel destinations, even some of my friendships based on this shared European heritage I thought we had. I felt connected to something larger than myself, part of a grand story of immigration and the American dream. My ancestors had supposedly overcome poverty and persecution to build a better life in America, and I was the proud continuation of their legacy. As my own children grew older and started asking questions about their family history, I found myself repeating the same stories my parents had told me. I bought them children's books about Ireland and Germany, taught them a few German phrases I'd learned in high school, and promised we'd visit the old country together someday. I was passing down what I believed to be our family legacy, never imagining that every word of it might be a lie. The first crack in my perfectly constructed family narrative appeared during a casual conversation with my daughter, Emma. She was working on a school project about family traditions from around the world. She'd been pestering me for weeks about specific details I simply couldn't provide. "Mom, what songs did your great-grandmother sing to you?" she asked one evening while we were making dinner. I paused, realizing I'd never actually heard any traditional Irish lullabies from my family, despite all our supposed heritage. "Well, honey, she died before I was born," I said, which was true enough. But then Emma pressed further. "What about great-grandpa? Did he teach Dad any German words?" I found myself scrambling for answers I didn't have. Dad knew about as much German as I did from high school classes, which wasn't much. The more Emma asked, the more I realized how shallow our family stories really were. That same week, my neighbor Maria was excitedly sharing results from her Ancestry DNA test. She'd discovered she was 30% Portuguese, which explained her olive complexion and why she felt so at home during a recent vacation to Lisbon. "You should totally do one," she said, practically bouncing with excitement. "It's amazing what you can learn about yourself." I found out I have distant cousins in Portugal that I never knew existed. The idea intrigued me, but when I mentioned it to Mom during our Sunday phone call, her reaction was immediate and intense. "Jennifer, why would you want to do something like that?" Her voice had an edge to it I rarely heard. "Those companies just want your personal information. It's not safe." When I pressed her about why she was so concerned, she became evasive. "We already know who we are. We don't need some test to tell us." Dad's reaction was equally strange. When I brought it up during our next visit, he actually laughed nervously and said, "Sweetheart, trust me, we're about as Irish and German as they come. No surprises there." But something in his tone made me uncomfortable. It was the same voice he used to use when I was a teenager. And he was hiding something, like when he'd already eaten half my Halloween candy but claimed he had no idea where it went. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other odd things. I was helping Mom clean out her closet when I found a small wooden box I'd never seen before, tucked away behind her winter coats. Inside were some old photographs of people I didn't recognize, and they definitely didn't look Irish or German to me. When I asked about them, Mom quickly took the box away and said they were just pictures from an old friend's family, nothing important. Then there was the phone call I accidentally overheard. I'd stopped by my parents' house to drop off some groceries, and I could hear Mom talking in hushed tones to someone. I caught fragments of the conversation. She has been asking questions, and we should have told her years ago, and most unsettling, what if she finds out the truth? When she saw me standing in the doorway, she quickly hung up and acted like nothing had happened. The final straw came when Emma's school project led her to ask if we could visit the local genealogy center to research our family tree. I thought it would be a fun mother-daughter activity, so I agreed. But when we got there and started looking through immigration records, we hit dead ends everywhere. There were no Schmidt families from Bavaria arriving during the time frame Dad had mentioned, and no Irish families with our last name coming through Ellis Island when Mom's parents supposedly immigrated. The librarian, a sweet older woman who'd been helping families research their histories for decades, seemed puzzled. "Sometimes records get lost or families change their names," she said kindly, "but usually we find something." After 2 hours of searching, we had absolutely nothing. Emma was disappointed, but I was starting to feel a creeping sense of dread. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the inconsistencies, all the evasive answers, all the missing pieces. David noticed I was tossing and turning. "What's wrong?" he asked, pulling me close. I told him about the failed research trip, about Mom and Dad's strange reactions to my questions, about the mysterious photographs. He listened quietly, then said something that made my heart race. "Honey, what if there's more to your family story than your parents told you?" The possibility that my entire identity might be built on lies was terrifying. I'd spent 34 years believing I knew who I was, where I came from, what made me tick. The idea that it might all be fabricated felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. But David was right. Too many things weren't adding up, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started doing my own research online, diving deep into genealogy websites and immigration databases. Every search came up empty. It was like my family's European history simply didn't exist. Meanwhile, Emma kept asking about her school project. And I found myself making excuses about why we couldn't find more information about our ancestors. The breaking point came when I found myself lying to my own daughter about our family history, repeating stories I was no longer sure were true. That's when I realized I had to know the truth, no matter how scary it might be. I had to take that DNA test, even if it meant discovering that everything I'd believed about myself was wrong. The decision to take a DNA test felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that jumping would change everything, but not knowing if I'd land safely or crash completely. For weeks after my failed research trip with Emma, I went back and forth, ordering the test kit online only to delete it from my cart at the last minute. The rational part of me knew I needed answers, but the scared part of me wondered if ignorance might actually be bliss. David was incredibly patient during this internal struggle. He'd find me staring at my laptop screen at midnight, cursor hovering over the purchase button. He'd gently ask, "What are you thinking?" I'd tell him about my fears. What if I wasn't who I thought I was? What if my parents had good reasons for keeping secrets? What if the truth was worse than not knowing? He'd listen, hold my hand, and remind me that truth, whatever it was better than living in doubt. The turning point came during Emma's school presentation. I sat in that classroom listening to her classmates share rich, detailed stories about their family traditions. There was Miguel, whose abuela had taught him to make tamales the same way her grandmother had in Mexico. There was Priya, who demonstrated a traditional Indian dance her family had been performing for generations. And there was my Emma, standing up front with a poster that had more empty spaces than information, trying to explain why we didn't have many family traditions to share. After the presentation, Emma's teacher pulled me aside. "Emma mentioned you've been having trouble finding information about your family history," she said kindly. "Have you considered DNA testing? It's becoming quite popular for exactly these situations." I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. Even Emma's teacher had noticed the gaps in our family's story. That night, I called my sister Jessica in Portland. Jess is 2 years younger than me and has always been more direct about things. When I told her about my growing doubts about our family history, her response surprised me. "Jen, I've been wondering about the same things for years," she said. "Remember when we were kids and Mom would get that weird look whenever anyone asked about Grandma and Grandpa? And how we never had any relatives at family gatherings, except for Dad's brother and his wife?" We talked for over an hour, comparing notes about all the strange little inconsistencies we'd noticed growing up. Jess remembered asking Mom once why we didn't have any photos of her parents, and Mom had given some vague story about a house fire. But when Jess pressed for details about when and where this fire happened, Mom couldn't provide them. We both remembered Dad's stories about growing up with German traditions, but neither of us could recall him ever demonstrating any actual German customs or speaking any German phrases beyond Guten Tag. "I think we need to know the truth," Jess said finally. "Whatever it is." She agreed to take a DNA test too, so we could compare results and have each other for support no matter what we discovered. The next morning, I finally clicked purchase on the DNA kit. My hands were shaking as I entered my credit card information, but I forced myself to complete the order before I could change my mind again. The confirmation email felt like a point of no return. I was really doing this. When the kit arrived 3 days later, I stared at the box for an entire afternoon before opening it. The instructions seemed so simple. Spit in a tube, seal it up, send it back. But I knew that this small action could potentially append everything I thought I knew about myself. David found me sitting at the kitchen table with the unopened kit, just staring at it. "Want me to sit with you while you do it?" he asked. I nodded, grateful for his steady presence. The actual process was anticlimactic. 30 seconds of spitting into a tube, another minute to seal and package everything, and then it was done. But as I dropped the prepaid envelope into our mailbox, my heart was pounding like I'd just run a marathon. There was no going back now. The waiting period was torture. The website said results would take 4 to 6 weeks, and every day felt like a year. I found myself checking my email constantly, even though I knew it was too early. I became obsessed with DNA testing forums and ancestry websites, reading story after story of people who'd discovered shocking truths about their families. Some had found long-lost relatives, others had discovered their parents weren't biologically related to them, and still others had learned they belonged to entirely different ethnic groups than they'd been raised to believe. Meanwhile, I couldn't look at my parents the same way. Every conversation felt loaded with hidden meanings. When Mom asked how I was doing, I wondered what she was really asking. When Dad made jokes about our stubborn German genes, I found myself analyzing his facial expressions for signs of deception. The worst part was that they seemed to sense something was different. Mom started calling more frequently, asking random questions about my day-to-day life. Dad suggested we plan a family vacation together, something he hadn't done in years. 3 weeks into the waiting period, I almost called to cancel the test. The anxiety was eating me alive, and part of me thought maybe Mom was right. Maybe we didn't need to know more than we already did. But then Emma asked me again about our family traditions for another school assignment. I realized I couldn't keep passing down stories I wasn't sure were true. My children deserved to know their real heritage, whatever that might be. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee and getting ready for work. Subject line: Your Ancestry new results are ready. I stared at that email for 5 full minutes before clicking on it, knowing that the next few minutes would either confirm everything I'd believed about myself or shatter it completely. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of Emma's dance studio when I finally opened that email. I'd been carrying my phone around for 3 days since the notification arrived, but I couldn't bring myself to look at the results when I was at home or work. Somehow, being in this neutral space felt safer, like if the news was devastating, I could just sit here and process it without having to pretend everything was normal for my family. My hands were trembling as I logged into the website. The page loaded slowly, and for a moment I wondered if I should just close my phone and drive away. But I'd come too far to turn back now. When the results finally appeared on my screen, I had to read them 3 times before the information actually sank in. Irish, 0%. German, 0% Eastern European, 78% specifically. Romanian, 45%. Hungarian, 22%. Slovak, 11%. Mediterranean, 15%. Specifically, Italian, 10%. Greek, 5%. Scandinavian, 4%. Broadly Sub-Saharan African, 3%. I literally said, "What the hell?" out loud in my empty car. This couldn't be right. There had to be some mistake. I was looking at the genetic makeup of a complete stranger, not Jennifer Schmidt from Ohio who grew up eating corned beef and cabbage every March. But as I scrolled down further, the results became even more shocking. The website had found potential DNA matches, distant relatives who shared segments of my genetic code. The closest match was listed as a second cousin named Andrei Popescu, living in Bucharest, Romania. There were dozens of other matches with surnames like Marinescu, names that sounded nothing like anything I'd ever heard in my family. I sat there staring at my phone screen, feeling like the world had tilted sideways. 78% Eastern European? I didn't know the first thing about Romanian culture, Hungarian traditions, or Slovak history. I couldn't even pronounce most of these country names properly, let alone claim them as my heritage. The Irish and German ancestry that had defined my entire identity simply didn't exist in my DNA. The Mediterranean results were equally baffling. Italian and Greek. When had anyone in my family ever mentioned connections to Southern Europe? I thought about all the times I'd complained about not being able to tan properly, joking that it was my pale Irish skin. Apparently I had Mediterranean ancestry that should have given me a completely different complexion. But perhaps the most startling discovery was that 3% Sub-Saharan African heritage. I stared at that line for 10 full minutes, trying to process what it meant. Somewhere in my family tree, there was African ancestry that no one had ever mentioned. In a family that had supposedly immigrated from Northern and Western Europe, this completely unexpected result felt like finding a puzzle piece from an entirely different box. I immediately called Jessica. She answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting by her phone. "Jess, did you get your results yet?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They came in yesterday," she said quietly. "Jen, we need to talk." "In person? Are yours completely insane too?" I asked. "Because according to this test, I'm basically Romanian."
Oh.
There was a long pause before she answered. "Mine say the same thing. Almost identical percentages. We're not Irish and German at all, Jen. We're not even close." We agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our cities the next day. I spent the rest of that evening in a daze, looking up information about Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia online. I read about Romanian history, looked at pictures of Hungarian traditional clothing, and tried to learn basic phrases in Slovak. It felt surreal, like I was researching foreign countries for a vacation rather than trying to understand my own genetic heritage. David found me at 2 a.m. still sitting at my laptop, surrounded by printouts about Eastern European immigration patterns. "Honey, you need to sleep," he said gently. But I couldn't sleep. My entire sense of self had been turned upside down in the space of a few hours. "What does this mean?" I asked him. "How can I be 78% Eastern European when my parents have been telling Irish and German stories my whole life? How is that even possible?" David sat down next to me and looked at the results I'd printed out. After a long moment, he said something that made my blood run cold. "Jennifer, what if your parents aren't your biological parents?" I'd been so focused on the unexpected ethnic breakdown that I hadn't even considered this possibility. But suddenly it made horrible sense. It's the lack of family photos, the missing immigration records, the evasive answers about family history. What if it was all because I wasn't actually related to the people who raised me? My mind raced through other possibilities. Maybe I was adopted and never told. Maybe there had been some kind of mix-up at the hospital when I was born. Maybe one of my parents wasn't my biological parent, and the other had been lying to cover it up. Each scenario felt more devastating than the last. I looked at the DNA matches again, scrolling through dozens of Eastern European surnames. These were my actual relatives. People I'd never heard of, living in countries I'd never visited. Meanwhile, the family I'd grown up with, the people whose stories had shaped my identity for 34 years, might not be related to me at all. The most heartbreaking realization was what this meant for Emma and Jake. If I wasn't actually Irish and German, then neither were they. I'd been passing down a fictional heritage to my own children, just as someone had done to me. They'd been learning about Celtic traditions and German customs that had nothing to do with their actual ancestry. As I finally crawled into bed that night, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Everything I thought I knew about myself was a lie. No. And tomorrow, I had to figure out who I really was. The meeting with Jessica confirmed my worst fears and gave me the courage I needed for the conversation I'd been dreading. We sat across from each other at a corner table in the coffee shop. Both of our DNA results printed out and spread between us like evidence in a criminal case. The numbers were nearly identical. We were definitely full sisters, but we were definitely not the Irish-German descendants we'd been raised to believe we were. "I've been thinking about this all night," Jessica said, stirring her coffee with shaky hands. "There are only a few explanations, and none of them are good. Either we were both adopted and never told, or Mom had an affair with someone completely different from who she claims Dad is. Or—" She trailed off, but I knew what she was thinking. "Or our entire family history is made up," I finished. "Jess, I think we need to confront them directly. This isn't something we can just ignore or hope goes away." We agreed that I would talk to them first, since I lived closer. The drive to my parents' house felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept rehearsing what I was going to say, but every approach seemed inadequate. How do you ask the people who raised you if they've been lying about fundamental facts for your entire life? I found Mom in her garden, tending to her tomato plants. She looked up when she heard my car door slam, and I could see immediately that she knew something was wrong. "Jennifer, honey, what's the matter? You look upset." For a moment, I almost chickened out. This woman had packed my lunches for 12 years of school, had stayed up all night when I had pneumonia, had cried at my wedding and held my babies when they were born. The idea that she might have been living a lie this whole time seemed impossible. But then I thought about Emma asking questions I couldn't answer, and I found my courage. "Oh, we need to talk. Is Dad home?" She nodded, and we went inside where Dad was watching a baseball game in his recliner.
Oh.
When he saw my face, he muted the television. "What's going on, sweetheart?" I pulled out the printed DNA results and spread them on the coffee table. "I took a DNA test," I said simply, "and these results don't match anything you've ever told me about our family." The silence that followed was deafening. Mom's face went completely white, and Dad's hands started shaking. Neither of them looked at the papers, but they didn't need to. Their reactions told me everything I needed to know. "Jennifer," Mom said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "we can explain." "Then please do," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "Because according to this, I'm 78% Eastern European, not a trace of Irish or German ancestry anywhere. And I've got DNA matches to relatives in Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia, places you've never mentioned once in 34 years. Dad cleared his throat and looked directly at me for the first time since I'd arrived. "Sweetheart, you have to understand, we were trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "From knowing who I actually am?" What came next was the most surreal conversation of my life. Through tears and halting explanations, the truth finally came out. My parents, the people I'd called Mom and Dad my entire life, weren't my biological parents at all. They were my great-aunt and great-uncle, Linda and Robert Schmidt, who had taken me in when I was just 6 months old. My biological mother was Mom's niece, Alina Popescu, had immigrated to the United States from Romania in the early 1980s. Alina had gotten pregnant during a brief relationship with a man whose identity remained unclear, possibly Hungarian or Slovak, based on my DNA results. Unable to care for a baby as a single immigrant with limited English and no family support, Alina had asked Linda and Robert to take me temporarily while she got established. Temporarily turned into permanently. "Mom," Linda explained through her tears. Alina was young and struggling, working 2 jobs just to survive. After a year, she asked us to adopt you officially. She thought you'd have a better life with us. And honestly, we'd already fallen in love with you. But here's where the story got even more complicated. Instead of telling me the truth as I grew up, Linda and Robert had created an entirely fictional family history. They decided it would be easier if I believed I was their biological child, descended from Irish and German immigrants like Robert's actual family. They'd made up stories about my grandparents, invented traditions, and constructed a complete mythology around my origins. "We thought we were doing the right thing," Robert said, his voice breaking. "We didn't want you to feel different or abandoned. We wanted you to feel like you belonged completely with us." "What about Jessica?" I asked. "Please tell me she's actually your daughter?" They exchanged a look that made my heart sink. "Jessica is Elena's younger daughter," Linda admitted. "Elena got pregnant again 2 years later and again asked us to take the baby. By then, we'd told everyone you were ours, so we just continued the story. I felt like I was in some kind of alternate reality. Not only was I not Irish and German, but I wasn't even their biological child. Jessica and I were actually cousins, not sisters, though we'd been raised as siblings. And somewhere out there was a woman named Alina Popescu, who was our biological mother, a woman I'd never met, whose name I'd never heard until this moment. "Is Alina still alive?" I asked. "We think so," Linda said quietly. "We lost touch with her years ago when she moved to California. We sent her pictures of you girls when you were little, but eventually the letters stopped coming back. The betrayal I felt was indescribable. These people I trusted completely had stolen my identity, erased my actual heritage, and replaced it with comfortable fiction. Every story they'd told me, every tradition they'd shared, every connection to ancestry they'd helped me feel, all of it was lies designed to make their deception easier to maintain. "I need to leave," I said, standing up abruptly. "I can't. I need time to process this." As I walked toward the door, Linda called out, "Jennifer, please. You're still our daughter. Nothing changes how much we love you." I turned around one last time. "Everything changes," I said. "Everything." The months that followed that devastating conversation were the hardest of my life. I felt like I was grieving the death of myself. The Jennifer I thought I was simply didn't exist, and I had to figure out who this new person was supposed to be. David was incredible during this time, holding me while I cried and listening patiently, as I worked through waves of anger, confusion, and profound sadness. The practical aspects of my new reality were overwhelming. I had to explain to Emma and Jake that everything I'd taught them about their heritage was wrong. 8-year-old Emma took it surprisingly well, mainly because she was excited to learn about new countries she'd never heard of. But explaining to my children that their grandparents weren't actually their biological grandparents was heartbreaking. The family structure they'd always known suddenly became much more complicated. Jessica and I supported each other through this identity crisis, but our relationship also had to be redefined. We were still sisters in every way that mattered. We'd been raised together, shared the same experiences, and had the same questions about our origins. But we were also cousins, daughters of a woman we'd never met, part of a Romanian family we knew nothing about. The decision to reach out to Alina took months to make. Linda had given me what little contact information she had, an old address in Los Angeles, and a phone number that might not still work. I must have started a dozen letters to Alina before finally settling on something simple. My name is Jennifer. I believe you are my biological mother. I would very much like to talk to you. When Alina called 3 weeks later, I was washing dishes after dinner. Her voice was heavily accented, and she spoke English carefully, as if she was translating each word in her head before saying it. Jennifer, this is Alina. I have been waiting for this call for 34 years. Our first conversation lasted for hours. Alina told me about her journey from Romania, about the poverty and political upheaval that had driven her to America, about the impossible choice of giving up her daughters so they could have better lives. She'd never stopped thinking about us, she said, but she'd respected Linda and Robert's wishes not to contact us directly. I see pictures sometimes on Facebook, she admitted. Linda, she friended me a few years ago. I see you graduate college, get married, have babies. I am so proud, but also so sad because I miss everything. Learning about my actual heritage was like discovering a completely different version of myself. Alina taught me Romanian words over video calls, sent me recipes for traditional foods, and shared stories about our family members still living in Europe. Through her, I connected with cousins in Bucharest who were eager to welcome their long-lost American relative. The cultural differences were fascinating and sometimes jarring. Romanian traditions around family, food, and celebration were nothing like the Irish and German customs I'd grown up pretending were mine. But as I learned more, certain things about myself started making sense in new ways. My love of rich, hearty foods, my dramatic tendencies, my fierce protectiveness of family, traits I'd attributed to fictional German stubbornness, were actually part of my Romanian heritage. The relationship with Linda and Robert took much longer to repair. I was furious with them for months, not just for the lies, but for the way they'd robbed me of my actual culture and family connections. They'd made a decision about my identity when I was too young to have a voice, and they'd maintained that deception for over 3 decades. But eventually, through family therapy and countless difficult conversations, I began to understand their perspective. They'd been young adults in their 20s when they took in a 6-month-old baby, and they'd been terrified of doing the wrong thing. In their minds, giving me a stable family narrative was more important than historical accuracy. They'd loved Jessica and me completely, raised us as their own, and genuinely believed they were protecting us from feeling abandoned or different. We were wrong, Robert finally admitted during one of our therapy sessions. I should have told you the truth from the beginning and helped you understand both parts of your heritage. But please believe that we never meant to hurt you. The process of forgiveness was gradual and is still ongoing. Linda and Robert are still Emma and Jake's grandparents, and they're still the parents who raised me. But our relationship now includes space for my biological mother and my actual heritage. It's messier and more complicated, but it's also more honest. Alina and I have developed a relationship that's part mother-daughter, part friendship. She can't be the mother who raised me. That role belongs to Linda. But she's the mother who gave me life and shares my genetic heritage. We're planning a trip to Romania next year so I can meet my extended family and see the places my ancestors actually came from. The most unexpected gift of this whole experience has been the expansion of my identity rather than its destruction. I'm not less than I was before. I'm more. I'm Irish and German by upbringing, and American by birth, but I'm also Romanian and Hungarian and Slovak by blood. I carry the stories of Elena's journey to America alongside the stories of Linda and Robert's love and sacrifice. My children are fascinated by their newly discovered heritage. Emma is learning Romanian phrases from Alina via video chat, and Jake loves the traditional foods Alina has taught me to cook. They understand now that family isn't just about DNA, it's about love, commitment, and the choice to show up for each other every day. Looking back, I understand why my parents made the choices they did, even though I disagree with them. They were trying to give me a simple, straightforward identity in a complicated world. But identity isn't supposed to be simple, it's supposed to be true. Now, when people ask about my heritage, I have a much more interesting story to tell. I'm the daughter of Romanian immigrants raised by German-Irish Americans, connected to families in 3 countries and fluent in the languages of love that transcend genetics. I finally know who I am, all of who I am. And it's more beautiful and complex than any story I could have imagined.